Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagol. Now, you'll be familiar with the term jailbreak, but here in Nigeria in the past week, the trending story has been of a prison collapse. A few days ago, more than 200 inmates escaped from a prison in the town of Kogi in Kogi State in central Nigeria after the prison walls gave way following heavy flooding. It's just the latest in a series of walkouts and breakouts from Nigerian jails, a country where prison breaks occur all too frequently. We'll speak about the deteriorating state of prisons in Nigeria in a moment with a lawyer and expert on security institutions, Kemi Okenyedo. But first, for the latest on that prison collapse, let's go straight away to our Lagos studios and speak to Arise correspondent Judita da Silva. Good to see you, Judita. It's been a wee while, so we're jolly glad that you're back on these shores again. But actually, this is it's good to see you, but it's not a funny thing. I mean, how did 150, 200, more than 200 prisoners walk out of a Nigerian jail?
So what happened was that this is, as you said, it was in Kogi prison, which is in Kogi State. It's central Nigeria, where the two main rivers, the Niger and Benue, meet. So what you have to understand is that because of torrential flooding, the nature of this state is very agrarian. It's easily devastated by things like floods. So you have homes are devastated, old buildings are, and these prisons are dating back to the colonial era. So what happened was the perimeter fence came down on the weight of the rain, and the cells started flooding. And so the prisoners felt the need to break out of their cells to not drown and find safety. And then this proportion of them took the opportunity to break free, as you said. But out of the number that were there, the capacity was 228 inmates. 106 stayed put, 122 escaped, and 25 have been recaptured. So in the past week since this happened, there are still 97 inmates still at large. So what you have to take into consideration is the nature of the state, the nature of very old colonialist buildings, which haven't been updated or fortified, and also the actual structure itself and the motivation of the prisoners, who the vast majority of them, because what happens within the legal system here is that both the convicted and the accused, those awaiting trial, are housed together. And the large percentage of those inmates are awaiting trial without any trial date set. So the motivation to break free is ever prevalent. And so when an opportunity strikes, they take it.
It's very interesting and rather scary what you say, because I mean the sum of it is that many of these inmates who escaped this custodial center in Kogi State, some of them have been recaptured, but quite a few are on the loose. And it begs the question, these people who've escaped and who are still on the loose, do we know if they are dangerous? Do we have any idea the sort of crimes they committed?
Yes, because there's different prisons are different structures. It's similar to the West. There's minimum security, medium security, and maximum security. Kogi prison is a medium security prison. So when let me break it down. So the minimum security prisons house things like petty theft. Felons like petty theft, that's the crimes you go to for there. In a medium security prison like Kogi, you've got robbery, and you've got things like medium violence, but not severe violence, more armed robbery. But then in maximum security, you have murderers and rapists. Basically, the most violent crimes go to maximum security. But the key to this here is that if I give you, for example, when you said that this is a trend that has happened before, another prison like Nsukka prison, when the jailbreak happened in 2016 and 15 people escaped, the key to this was that 95% of the people housed in that prison hadn't actually been convicted. They were just awaiting trial. That was the same thing as Kogi. So the vast majority of these people, imagine, who knows, could be innocent if they actually get their day in court. That is the frustration that happens there, because you do know that 106 chose to stay and didn't break free. So as far as the danger they pose to society, it wouldn't be as bad as the maximum security felons that you would be thinking about, which would be murderers, rapists, and terrorists, and high-profile prisoners. But still, these would be robbers and members of gangs, because one of the a few of the other jailbreaks that have happened in this prison as well was when, for instance, Boko Haram broke through a wall and set free about 117 inmates. 7 of them were members of Boko Haram. So when you're kind of understanding the motivation behind the proliferation of this trend of jailbreaks, you have to know why these people have the motivation to break free, because they feel the justice system has failed them and hasn't given them their opportunity for due process.
And that's a very interesting point, because, of course, many of the people, I mean, who go, as you mentioned, some of them are awaiting trial, but the conditions in jail and the sort of conditions under which they're held, the people they meet in jail, turns them into something that they're actually not. I mean, I overheard someone quoting the Minister of Interior in 2018 saying that people go into, and this is the Minister of Interior, saying that people go into Nigerian jails as goats and come out as lions. I mean, that sounds positively terrifying, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because there's 2 things that go into that. It's kind of the pathology and the psychology of the criminals that go in, or the assumed criminals that go in. The biggest problem that they're tackling is overcrowding. These prisons are packed beyond capacity. And so when you have people who are convicted and people who are, they're accused but not convicted, you have a situation where you end up with the cross-pollination of criminal styles. People who went in as petty felons, in order to survive in a situation where you have overcrowding in these prisons, you've got to turn from a lamb to a lion in order to survive until you get your trial date, if you get one at all. So that's an issue you've got to deal with, because for instance, when you think about somewhere like the UK, one of the ways they battled overcrowding is when they introduced the antisocial behavioral orders. That was a situation where they wanted to prevent young people getting into the criminal system by going to jail and graduating to more severe criminals. In Nigeria, there are 240 prisons approximately, and it has a capacity of 50,000. There are actually 75,589 people incarcerated at this time. Of that, 51,000, just over 51,000 are awaiting trial, and 95% of them are under the age of 30. So these are people in their teens and 20s that are in prison. So Nigeria's youth are in prison without trial dates and have only been accused and haven't had due process. They are actually cross-pollinating with convicted criminals who have committed crimes and have to find a way to survive through this. That's how you get a situation where you are almost cultivating a new wave of criminals.
Absolutely extraordinary. And I suppose the original idea of a prison, which is that it's supposed to be a correctional facility, is completely lost, isn't it?
Absolutely, because when you think about prisons, the idea of the pathology of the criminal, you commit a crime, then you should have access to adequate legal counsel. Upon that, you should then have rehabilitation and then reintegration into society. That is the theory, that is utopia. But with these prisons, when you see the conditions in there, committing a crime strips you of your civil liberties, not your fundamental human rights. Every criminal, no matter what they have done, has the right to eat, has the right to be clean, and has the right to be healthy. These are things that are not afforded the majority of prisoners, if any at all. That changes the psychology of a criminal to think that in many cases, even though I might have been disenfranchised, hence I didn't have legal counsel and I ended up in the situation, I am worse off as a human with my treatment in prison than I would be if I escaped and went rogue. That's your motivation. And the nature of prisons is something that is the legacy of colonialism. Being a former British colony, the UK functions as a monolith. It's hierarchical. There was a monarch, there were the noblemen, there were the bourgeoisie, there was the proletariat, and then the extraneous elements of society who were the criminals. That can't work in a country like Nigeria. I remember I had a lecturer in university who said, countries like India and Nigeria should ideally have something like a pragmatic communism, because there are different tribes have different languages, they have different beliefs, they have different traditions. You cannot have a singular point of power and your penal and judicial system governed by them, and everyone falls underneath, because then who do you decide is the haves and the have-nots? Is it the Yoruba people? Is it the Igbo people? Is it the Ijos? Is it the Hausas? This is always going to be an issue. So when you're thinking about prison reform, you have to understand the dynamic and the geography and the nature of a country like Nigeria, so you don't end up governing people by a structure that wasn't built to understand them, which is what you have here.
That's a very, very interesting theory. But given all that you've said, and you've put it very sort of eloquently there, how worried should we be about the prison system in Nigeria?
I would say very worried indeed, because what I said, what's the most important thing is overcrowding isn't being remedied. These structures hark back to the colonial era. They haven't been fortified. They haven't been rebuilt. What they're showing is that proliferation will set in because inmates will know, I can break free. In Kogi Cafe, there was a point where in 2016, 13 prisoners escaped because they broke through the wall. They literally broke the wall down. That should be impossible in a prison. So if you don't think about the practicalities of your structure cannot hold its contents, this is going to continue to happen and happen more often. And when you see with groups like Boko Haram, people will get bolder. They'll go for maximum security prisons and start to release people you really don't want getting back into society.
Scary movie. Judita, thank you very much indeed, and I appreciate your analysis and the time you've taken to put these things in perspective for us. Judita da Silva, our correspondent there, talking to me from our studios in Lagos. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the deteriorating state of prisons in Nigeria. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Onyegolu. Now, periodically, and some would say rather too frequently for comfort, prison breaks occur in Nigeria. If it isn't raids carried out by members of the militant group Boko Haram to free their comrades in arms, it's your standard prison break organized from within as a result of internal systemic corruption, payoffs, and so on. At one stage, there were around 3 massive jailbreaks in the country within the space of a month. It raised questions about why the authorities in Nigeria don't seem able to secure the country's prisons. Analysts and civil society groups say it speaks to the great problem of very low morale in the security services, with prison officers in particular, and the prison system in general coming up as one of the most neglected in Nigeria's security apparatus. They say there needs to be a reorganization and rehabilitation of the entire prison system and more attention paid to the welfare of both the prison officers and the prisoners. Well, for more insight on the deteriorating state of prisons in Nigeria, I'm joined now in the studio by the lawyer and expert on security institutions, Kemi Okenyedo. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. First of all, just tell me about your NGO and what you do.
Okay, so we are the Rule of Law Empowerment Initiative, and we're also known as Partners West Africa Nigeria. And we are dedicated to citizens, enhancing citizens' participation in security and governance. So our program focuses basically, we look at criminal justice reform, we look at security sector reform, and we look at governance broadly. We're also a bit more tilted to women participation in governance, and in recent times looking at youth participation in peace and security architecture.
Does that mean you go to prisons quite a lot?
Yeah, under our rule of law program area, we have a public defenders unit. So the public defenders unit carry out legal clinics, and we also involved in legal aid services. So part of the constituency, you would understand, is awaiting trial population in prisons. So we have lawyers that go to the prisons, we have paralegals that also go to the prisons.
And there's a lot of people awaiting trial.
Presently, I know I think according to the National Correctional Services data, as at mid last month, it should be about 69% of the prison population nationwide awaiting trial.
And all these people held in dire conditions.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the beauty in the prison population is that when you see it is when you appreciate it better. Those awaiting trial are those that are basically under the radar, let me just put it like that.
Forgotten people.
Forgotten in a lot of cases. And when I would interject with illustrations. Mm-hmm. So recently we were in Ondo.
Ondo is in the southwest.
In the southwest of Nigeria. We were in Ondo State, accompanying the Chief Justice team on prison decongestion exercise. And we had a list of over 1,000 inmates awaiting trial from like 3 years to 9 years.
Just in that prison?
Just in Ondo, awaiting trial. And some of them have never had their day in court. Some of them for little reasons like language. So I'll give an example. There were some group of boys that were picked up, arrested, detained, but they're from the north. They speak Hausa. Within the team in Ondo, nobody speaks or understands Hausa. So communication.
Let's be safe and just lock them up.
Yes. So they had been there, if I'm correct, for about between 5 to 7 years.
My goodness.
Yes. But luckily, my colleague that went understood Hausa. So our legal aid services now was broadened a bit to include translation for the courts.
How do those people survive in jail?
The budget is lean. So it's like contests for minimal resources. It's like, it's overcrowded.
But the state does actually feed them, does it?
They do feed. However, for feeding, if I'm correct, it's easier to budget for those that have been convicted rather than for those that are waiting.
Right.
Right? So
they're in a sort of no man's land.
Yes. So at times for those are waiting, there's the support from churches, from philanthropists that come into the prisons, from family members that try, to ensure that they're well taken care of. So their welfare package is not as adequate, quote and unquote, as those that have been convicted.
But of course the presumption is that your family actually know where you are.
The presumption is they ought to know where you
Right.
are. And of course, in some cases, and in a lot of cases, they don't know.
And why do you think Nigerian prisons are that way?
I think the Nigerian prisons, like the other facets of the criminal justice system, is suffering from the same thing that the police, the courts, the ministry, whether they want to admit it or not, and the prisons are suffering from. And that's a case whereby we have a colonial legacy, an attempt to sit down and really look at our system to see what ought to happen. How do we pragmatically change this entire system? The conversation has really not been had. We're having these conversations in bits and pieces. We tend to put a lot of focus on, which is not bad, and let me quickly put that caveat, that our reform lens is looking at the legislations, which is good. Legislations within which context? It's like putting new wine in old skin. It will burst. It cannot contain it. Prison structures are old. I think our prisons were built 1861 or so. and what was the population size, what was it meant for. And now 2019, and we're saying 2019 November, going to the end of another decade, right? And we should ask ourselves, even with the new legislation, the Correctional Services Act, with the Administration of Criminal Justice Act, the structures we have on ground, can it cater to this new legislations? What is being done about this? What is happening in other climates that we can borrow from, that can reposition our prisons as part of the criminal justice system?
In America, for instance, the prisons are privatized in many ways. Do you think that might make a difference in this country?
It should. I'll illustrate something to you. When we talk about police reform in Nigeria and the call for state police, the same law that abolished state police then was the same law that abolished state prisons then. But you find it interesting that when we're calling for a reintroduction of state police, nobody ever talks about the prisons. So you say that they do not think the prisons are an integral part of the process.
The criminal justice system. Right.
The control and the advantage of controlling police, having the judiciary on your side, the politicians seem not to have seen it with the prisons. And so at times in our office or among colleagues, when we're talking and we're joking, I'm like, a state police, a law enforcement officer would arrest, probably prosecuted in the state high court, to be detained where? In a federal prison.
Absolutely.
How does that make sense? So that's where, your point of having, is it privately owned prisons? Or do we look at regional prison blocks? So,
and what about the National Assembly? Presumably it has oversight of these things. I'm just wondering whether anybody ever looks at these things and raises the alarm from an authority sort of point of view. You see what I mean? That, they've got budget oversight, they've got, the running of the prison oversight. Why, given all that, why are the prisons still a mess?
The question you ask is, what's the capacity and what's the quality of the oversight that comes from the Parliament, from the National Assembly, for example? How are budgets presented? How are there plans? And I'll take it back to the new legislations. So we're already in the process of preparing budgets for next year. Is the National Assembly looking at this new correctional services? And your sense is that they're not? Yeah, I don't think so. Okay. And then you asking the prisons, correctional services, what are your plans for the implementation of ensuring that some of this is achieved, right? I'm really sorry about this, but we've actually run out of time. No problem. But I want to thank you very much indeed. Very depressing note to end on, but I appreciate your explanation and your analysis. Kemi Okenyedo is, of course, the lawyer and expert on security institutions. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again for a fresh edition tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.